A little bit, because it's a little bit washed out for the live stream.
Nice for us, we didn't not involved in small church.
It's not a big deal.
When we're not there, it's it's good. It's good.
I think we're supposed to start in like 4 minutes.
And I've got everything from the podium here.
Oh, do I? Is this ready to go?
So that's going to pick up speakers and everything, but yes.
I should use
that
this?
just so people in the back can hear you.
Okay.
It doesn't look like the right size.
Yeah.
I know, I was going to say, this doesn't look like it's... So does that mean I should hold it? Or...
I would hope, because they've got it hooked up so.
Let me just test this.
Curtis is at Deer Valley. Curtis is super help Deer Valley. He's got 35 boxes. Morning, how you doing, Tim? Live the dream. In recent history, the race was what, maybe
So that might be what I'm saying.
Oh, you know what?
that was a wrestle.
So she's using that whoever's speaking doesn't
They've been wrestling like that. That's tougher than that big time wrestling, that's tougher than that.
So does this just... Okay, I think this just comes off. And I think this just goes on. Let me take this off. Am I doing this right?
Looks like it.
And then that just goes there?
Yeah, you got this. You don't need to be. I guess it depends if people are standing here or they're going to want to walk. I know some people like to walk around.
Yeah. Okay, I go like that. That should do it, right? Let me get that out of the way.
Do we need to have to go through the bottom to get the food?
Whoa.
Yeah, that was already coming and starting to come out.
Okay,
Because now you're undoing the bottom cap. So is this part okay? So is it actually something going?
I think that's perfect right there, I think. And then these are the batteries in case, I guess in case this runs out.
I'm trying to see if I can.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Way back. I saw them wrestle in state championships, Class C state championships at Village. When I was in college, I met the buddies. And this Jay, the older kid, I think he was like this is 185, and he was didn't look. He was looking at the basketball player with a small hole, 6'1", and his kid from Charlotte was the wrestler. He came to wrestle, and he looked. Well, he had muscles.
I think that'll keep it a little.
One of those guys.
Throw it tight.
So I thought this kid from Charlotte was the Turkish kid from Montreal.
That's why I have that big hiking bag. Keep all my tools in. And then we'll come off easy in case somebody.
I'm going to tell them 1 minute.
I'll just take it off. I just put it on that.
Oh no. what I just did.
1 minute to grab your coffee and food and sit down. Starting in 1 minute.
You're like afraid to put that on, right?
Well, just leave it. I mean, it might stay better now. Now, if they're going to walk around, then yeah, we're going to.
Then you want to put that on. Okay, yeah.
This will actually work better for. This actually works better to see.
Just leave it like that. Okay.
Now, if somebody's going to be grabbing us to walk around,
then put the bat.
What kind of actually the other way.
Sounds good.
Maybe that's why I was in there. Maybe that's why I was stashed away.
Yeah, exactly.
Good to see you.
Hi. Yeah, we've been before. It's nice to see you again. So
I'll open up and then I'll turn it over to you for a bit.
Okay, perfect. Okay, sounds good. You get out of here.
Good deal. Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's nice to see everyone again. I hope you're well rested, didn't have too many traffic problems. Only took me an hour and a half from Goodyear, so maybe I was lucky. I don't know. Anyway, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Ty. I'm your proud president of ASA this year. It's an honor to serve in that role. I appreciate your faith in me. Thank you for that. It's kind of exciting. I know we're at the start of the school year. That always jazzes me up, and real happy to be here this morning. I hope you've had a great start to your school years. You know, some of you look real rested, and some of you look like you have the Monday morning crises already going. Phones are lit up. So back on the treadmill. I don't know if we ever jumped off. I don't know what happened this summer. It used to be like a little bit of respite, but I don't think it happened this year. So anyway, hopefully you got some rest, some relaxation. Great to be here this morning. Great seeing all of you. It's almost like a little bit of a family reunion because some of you haven't seen in a while, and we're like extended family all the time. We spend together, the misery we share, and the celebrations together. So want to thank our sponsor. We have Nivea Clausen here from Better Lesson. She wants to say a few words. We have great breakfast here, so come on up, Nivea.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm actually going to start by telling you how we could support you with bringing money to your school district. There's actually two really great grant opportunities that we are working with school districts to write in partnership with them. So we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting on writing of the grant. But one of them is for school districts that are really looking to bring diverse leaders into their school districts. And basically it is a plan to support the planning, the training around bringing diverse leaders into your school districts. Now, the only thing is that both of these grants, the deadline is September 13th, but the amount of funding that they're providing is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if this is something that you think, if you're already kind of starting with a plan for bringing diverse leaders to your school district and you're just looking for funding, that's kind of where you want to be on that. Please, there's business cards all over the desks or on top of your tables. Please reach out to me and I can provide you with some more information if it's something that you think you might be interested in. It is a grant that they offer every year. So even if you wouldn't be able to do it this year, it might be something that you'd be interested in doing next year. And one that just came out is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. This is providing $300,000 to $750,000 over the course of either a year starting in January 2020 or for 48 months. And it is for 6th through 12th grade. So this is more for the secondary ones. And it is, if you have a specific school practice that is more student-centered in focusing on the whole child. So if you're interested in learning more about either one of those, please reach out to me and I'm happy to provide you information. And as I said, we will be doing the heavy lifting on the grant writing portion of it. I do want to thank some of our partners, and some of you are here today. We have currently partnered with these school districts in supporting their various initiatives, from restorative justice practices to culturally responsive teaching and learning to supporting their math curriculum. We basically are doing it through one-to-one coaching for leaders, teachers, and coaches, as well as on-site full-day workshops and mini workshops through virtual workshops that are between an hour and 2 hours long. So just really quickly to tell you a little bit about what we do, we are Better Lesson, and we are reimagining professional development by really bringing professional development to school districts in a way that is more personalized, more continuous. We do have over 100 coaches from throughout the United States. Our selection process is pretty intense and thousands of people apply. We only accept 4%. They love to come work in an environment like Better Lesson because they get a lot of professional development. They're part of PLCs, and it's just an environment of learning and growing. So these are the people that do the coaching and the mentoring. These are a few of the people that do the coaching and mentoring. And basically our model is one-on-one and customize. We use Zoom, so the cost is very limited because you're not paying for people to travel to your school district. Because they're accountability partners, but they're not part of the district. Oftentimes teachers and coaches and leaders will be able to really be vulnerable with them in terms of shifting their practice. And we utilize a try, measure, learn methodology. Try a strategy, look at evidence of the effectiveness of that strategy, and reflect on the strategy. Everybody gets a lab, and the lab that we provide, by the way, is free. So any of you that have social emotional learning initiatives, coachly responsive teaching and learning, if you go to betterlesson.com, all of those strategies that was funded by a $26 million grant from the Gates Foundation are available to anybody to use for free. So within the lab, we do provide tools for the teachers to basically share the video from inside the classroom or evidence. So this is kind of showing you a video of how we do a lot of the coaching, which is through Zoom. This is an example of evidence that a teacher would bring to show how the strategy is working, and sometimes it's video of students. All of the labs do have an administrator dashboard. So if you've got, let's say, 5 or 10 teachers being coached or leaders being coached, you have just a quick place that you can take a look at kind of what strategies that they're working on, if they're attending meetings, and just a very quick kind of way to see how things are going. We do the full day workshops because we are looking at a different way of doing professional development. We don't do launching workshops where, you know, there's 100 people and a person is presenting. These are smaller, and the focus is on shifting practice on an initiative that you're focused on. So let's say that your initiative is student engagement. The idea is we do the workshop and then it would be followed. Oh, it's not on?
No.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me back there? Okay. I used to be a high school English teacher, so I project. So the idea is the teachers would be able to come together for a full day on-site training, but then we would provide job embedded coaching support for those teachers as well. So it's not a one and done. It's, you know, let's engage on in a focus that for your district in terms of an initiative, but then let's provide teachers with one-on-one support. And that's comes by way of 30 minutes every 2 weeks. And in this case, it would typically be around 4 sessions. We do mini workshops as well. And so for some school districts, you don't have a full day, but you do have an hour, you have 2 hours. And we do it through Zoom. Basically, these teachers will come together. We use live chat, breakout groups, a lot of ways to actually get teachers to use their devices to check in instead of checking out. And they're really highly interactive. We never have more than 13 to 15 because that's as many faces as you can actually fit in a Zoom. But they do a lot of breakouts, a lot of pair share and group activities. So that's Better Lesson. I did provide you with a few resources. This just tells you a little bit more about what we do. We do have a lot of research behind the effectiveness of the training. So this is an example from Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools. We have many more case studies that we've done. If you're interested, I'll leave some of these behind. We did do a white paper for those of you that have blended learning initiatives, but it's support for different strategies that work for different teacher archetypes. And for those of you that are planning to implement an instructional coaching program, we've also written a white paper on that. So I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a great meeting.
Well, thank you, Navia. Thank you for a great breakfast too. We appreciate that. So I wanted to share very quickly a couple thoughts too as we're switching out technology. First, I want to acknowledge the great leadership that Jerry Jennings gave for the organization last year. So thank you, Jerry. Appreciate it. I have some big shoes to fill up here. I didn't say that. So some interesting things I just want to share real quick. Jerry had a nice theme about the head, hearts, hands, and I didn't really have that kind of a thing, but I wanted to share personal experience that would be maybe inspirational for you. A couple things we did to kick off our school year that you may want to do as well. We had our keynote speaker was Jason Schechterly. And if you don't know Jason, back in 2001, he was a Phoenix police officer, was rear-ended, vehicle going 115 miles an hour, car burst into flames, badly burned, wasn't expected to live, and so he's a motivational speaker now, and is just incredible. A lot of teary eyes in our staff for our convocation, but highly recommend him. He's a West Valley guy, and just did a great job getting our staff motivated and just recognizing the things in life that we sweat over sometimes just aren't really worth worrying about, and things could always be worse, and it could change like overnight. So very motivational. Another thing we did with our kids is just this past week for our middle and high school students, we brought them all together, did some video broadcasting because we don't have a space to seat them all, but had Antoine Fisher come. So if you've watched the movie, Antoine, very motivational, had all kinds of adversities, very successful man now. And he, with Rick Miller from Kids at Hope, sponsored a symposium with our kids. And it's the first time they've done it with kids. It's pretty heavy duty adult stuff if you've seen the movie, but really good. Our kids have been talking about it. It was last Thursday and all day Friday. A lot of things that they connected with too. So a lot of good things going on in my district. I know you also have wonderful things going, but I want to share those too, just some ideas that you may want to replicate too, because they're very successful for us. So now I'll stop talking. Technology's ready. And we have some great guests here to share some important information, be available to answer questions. And I believe we'll have standing agenda items at our meetings for some of our guests, including John Caruth from the Department, almost said the Department of Ed. Yes, from the Department of Ed, Chief of Staff of the Department of Ed. So John, I just saw him a minute ago. There he is. He said he'll keep it to under an hour. We appreciate your presence and the very transparent collaboration that you and the department have been having with us.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be here, and it feels like I'm home when I'm here. All right. Thanks, Mark. Adjusting to a different rhythm outside of a school calendar after having been part of a school district for 26 years. So, and what that rhythm feels like. So your rhythm feels much more familiar to me. And as Paul mentioned, I'm not sure that summer exists so much for any of us any longer. I want to talk to you about two things that I think will be helpful. I'm hoping they are helpful, and then just open it up to see if you have any questions related to what I'm talking about or other areas that we're working on with the department. Dr. Heather Cruz is also here as well, so she will help me get unstuck if I get stuck on something in particular. We in the department we intentionally wanted to focus on several things, but one of them is truly being a resource and providing clarity around policy decisions and those kinds of things. And so one of the issues that came up right away this last legislative session was the school counselor and SRO grant. It was stated in the governor's budget. It passed and was signed into law, adding $20 million in additional funds for that. The governor's intent on that was that those dollars get out quickly, and we want to help do that. The hitch was that those dollars were appropriated to a competitive grant bucket that came with several statutory strings attached. And so we needed to work through some of the legalese. I won't bore you with those details, but we need to work through some of the legalese pieces of those to be able to move those dollars out into school districts this fall instead of having to wait to this spring, which is what this statute said. So I know there's been a lot of information about this, and some conflicting information, I think, and so I want to help provide some clarity of that, especially to you, to those of you as you are considering applying for those funds. So the department has gathered a large group of stakeholders to help us unpack this process. And I think that the takeaways for you, if I'm in your shoes, are that we expect that the grant application for this will be open sometime in about a month, so sometime in mid-September. So you should be looking at your school district level for notification of that grant opening. We anticipate that those grants will be open for about 2 weeks, somewhere in that process, and then taking the awardees to the board at the October board meeting. Okay, I can talk more about what that looks like, and I'll get into some of the components of that. The idea, though, is if those funds are fully encumbered in this fall round, that would be great. They will all go out the door at that time. If those funds are not fully encumbered in the fall time period, they will carry over and then fall into the traditional spring grant cycle. So, and that will depend, we're just not sure on how ready schools and school districts will be and what that looks like. These, as you are thinking from your perspective, what are the pieces that you need to be considering? I would suggest that you begin to consider these things as what's in statute that are required for the school counselor and SRO grants. So a detailed description of need. What are a law-related education program or demonstrates existence of a law-related education program. This is all for the SRO. How are they going to be trained? Information success in the most grants previous participant. And then on the school counselor and social work side and local community services. So in other words, if they work for you in your schools, there's a relationship back out into the community so that you can amplify the effect of those positions both in your schools and in your community. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. And then how are you going to use them? What are the methods for evaluating the effectiveness of those positions? And then confidentiality pieces. So how are you going to notify parents and other family members who are using those resources that they meet FERPA and so on. So pretty straightforward, basic criteria. I would encourage you not to overthink what those strategies are and simply begin to think about how you're going to implement that at your schools. And by the way, the grants will be issued at the school. They'll flow through LEAs, but they'll be issued at the school level. So if you think of $20 million as a personnel amount, depending upon total cost, somewhere between 200 and 400 people is what this will affect. Okay. What the application review process is tentatively, these are kind of a draft tentative process of what that will look like. They're going to be all pooled together. So after the post grant window closing, we'll pool them together. Part of the grant is going to ask you to rank order your priority for those positions at the school level. The application needs to be complete, basic pieces. And then if they're incomplete, you'll have an opportunity to reapply for those in the fall, again, in the spring, for that spring window. And if there's more applications than there are positions, then we're working on a rubric to be able to identify how to rank them. So, okay, pretty straightforward, simple stuff. Any questions on that? Great.
John, if you already have a grant from you expect those, that's going to
just so make sure everybody just go off. I'm back on. Not sure what happened. So the biggest question was if you're on a 3-year grant, this is the 3rd year of that grant right now. What do? You apply in fall or do you apply in spring? And the question answer to that is yes, that's up to you. So you can do either or. So if you want to apply for this $20 million, to add to that, you can do that now. And there will be the remaining funds will be the funds that have been there will continue to be there and open up in a spring window as well.
Just to clarify on that, because I'm still a little bit confused. So if we want to add on, we would apply this fall. But if we want to renew or continue or extend, we would apply for that part of it in the spring. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's our understanding of this right now. This is what I'm telling you. So this is very well said. If you want to add on, apply in the fall. If you want to continue, apply in the spring. That's our understanding right now. That's the working group is carrying that forward. So that's the working concept of that at this time.
Hey, John, so if we want to apply for both SRO and school counselor, school social worker, but we prioritize which is higher priority to us?
Yes. So you'll prioritize of those 3 positions, which you'll rank order them in priority. Yep. Okay. Yep.
I noticed the component of the connection with the community through the counselors and the social workers. I know from previous experience, the cut scores on that program were somewhere in the neighborhood of 87, 88, so a very high cut score. I'm a little concerned, especially for rural districts or communities that don't have the community component. That's a significant portion of the criteria. Then you can get yourself aced out of on a cut score just by losing those 5 or 6 or 7 points. Because if you're running at 87 or 88 as a cut score out of 100, you got to have a pretty high standard. So how are you going to affect those districts that may not have resources in their community to work with for the social workers or advice counselors?
So what about rural schools, in particular, where counselors or social workers may be more difficult to acquire and/or there aren't as many community services? So this is going to, the rubric is just to help kind of rank order what's remaining. The primary intent, and we've heard this over and over from the governor's office, is to get the dollars out the door as fast as we can. That's why we're asking. It's kind of it's a little bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing, but that's why we're asking for you to rank order your priority of those, because if this moves forward the way it is currently on the path to do that, we will be able to give everybody their first choice. I mean, that would be the ideal. The ideal would be those that apply get their first choice. And then it wouldn't fall into a rubric. The rubric will only come in if we get 500 requests or something like that. And how do we sort them? But it's going to look, we don't have the exact components of the rubric worked out, but it's not going to be, that will look different than a traditional competitive grant. And I'll tell you, we've had conversations inside the department specifically around what you just addressed, which are what are the different contexts that play out in our rural schools, and how do we make sure that there's some equitable distribution of these funds across the state.
So the notion that you said, John, on the continuing, so if you have an SRO grant, which some of us have, then you would apply now to add on these social worker, possibly counselors, based on your criteria, and then you would go for the SRO continuation in the spring?
That's correct. Yep.
Are you going to need to apply for a renewal on what you get in the fall as well, in the spring?
I don't think so. No, because that'll start a 3-year grant cycle. So it's another some of the statutory language that we had to wrestle through, because it's going to throw us off kilter of the traditional 3-year grant cycle, which is every April 15th. Another some of the statutory language that we had to wrestle through, because it's going to throw us off kilter of the traditional 3-year grant cycle, which is every April 15th, I think, is the date. So us off. What we eventually want to do is be able to merge those 2 dates, but we're going to have to do that down the road. So if you get the fall one, that starts a 3-year window for that $20 million allocation.
Hey, John, and this is still in process, has to go to the board for approval?
Yes. Okay. Yes, and we're hoping to get that to the board this month, next week. Yes.
What happens if an approved grant is unable to fill the position? Is that unable
what happens if an improved grant is unable to fill the position? We've had conversations about that as well, and frankly, we feel that that is up to you as a local community to address. We're not going to stand in your way of saying this is a need. We want you to be able to have access to that, to those dollars, to be able to do your darndest to fulfill that need.
If you already are funding a counselor, but you like the grant for that, can you put that money back into your budget to support children another way?
Yeah.
I was staying away from that.
Yeah. Okay. So what happens if you've got somebody that you're already paying for? Can you bump them over? This is new money. I'm not going to get away. Yeah. It's new money intended for new positions. I'll just say that. Yep.
Well, kind of still on that tone, and maybe you'll just tell me the same answer. Some of us did not get the grant after having it for 20 some years. So we having it funded, but struggling to fund it. So the hearing is possibly if you get it approved, you can in the next year go back to where you were with the grant funding. So if we funded it for the 2 years that we haven't received it, or tried to fund it with the police department,
So I think the safe.
would that be something?
So the question is, I think the question is the position existing and is alternately being funded? I think you would struggle to then take a position that's currently being funded, alternately funded, however it's funded, and then back that into this grant. I think the guidepost on this is the intent is to add how much ever $20 million will in new positions above the baseline of what is existing in schools today. I think that's the best baseline. Those are the kinds of really, frankly, nitty gritty detail questions we're going to have to work out, but that is the intent. That's clearly the intent. Okay. And an area where we're hoping to be a leader, if not a strong partner in the conversation, and that's around special education funding. And I want to share with you for the first time some special education data that we've collated. We've done this work in partnership with Annabelle Apertella from ASBA. And I know there's a lot of conversations about special education funding going on as policies being considered for next legislative session. So this first slide is simply a demographic slide of all students in Arizona from 2000 to 2019. Blue represents students who are in regular education. Orange represents students who receive services with an IEP, okay? So one quick takeaway, in 2000, as a state, we had about 9.5% students with special ed. We have seen an increase of about 2.5% from 2000 to 2019. So when we think about the overall growth of special ed relative to the general population, it's been pretty small. That's it by a percentage. Okay, 9.7 to 12.42.
Unweighted enrollments.
Unweighted, yes. This is the bigger takeaway. Where has that growth occurred? So, and I'm a former special ed guy, so this is, I felt this. I was a special ed director in the early 2000s, actually late 90s and early 2000s. We had the bar to pay attention to. Again, this is students in general education. The yellow and blue bars are students in special education, with the aggregate being the students in yellow being autism, the category of autism. So in 2000, we served a very small portion of the population with autism, and today that group has grown significantly. So again, if you look at that bar as an aggregate, and you assign where the growth is in special education, the growth primarily has been driven in special education by the category of autism. All right? You all know this, and you've heard Chuck talk about it before, the Group B weighted count piece. Autism is weighted in two different ways relative to whether a student the amount of service time they receive, which indicates whether they're self-contained or in resource. Roughly, one is about $23,000 in add-on weight, one's about $24,000 in add-on weight, okay? This is the only one I'm going to disaggregate as far as regular school district and charter schools, but you can see, again, from 2000 to 2019 where that growth is. So students, this is only autism, disaggregated by where they reside. Are they in a traditional school district or in a charter school? You can see the students in self-contained, not as many in charter schools. You can see students who fit that resource category has grown significantly in charter schools. Okay? But if you remember back to 2000, you rarely heard autism spectrum disorder, you rarely heard Asperger's. Any of those terms were not common. If a student had autism, they were generally very significantly involved, especially around issues of behavior and communication. Okay? So Annabelle took a look at everybody's AFRs and pulled out where the funding goes for that. So the orange bar is the special ed funding combined Group A and Group B, all right? And the blue bar represents what was actually spent, all right? So there's a gap. There was a gap. The gap has continued to grow. And kind of the last slide that I'll throw up here is there are some schools, both traditional schools and charter schools, who when you add Group B and Group A weights together, they actually have a positive gap. In other words, they're receiving more money than they are expending for special education services. But there is a larger, more significant gap of primarily school districts who are spending more than they are receiving. Again, this is not novel. I know it's not novel, but I think what I hope it does and what I hope it can breathe some life into these conversations are some data to bring to the table around some policy discussions about this issue. So you could say the funding gap is only $138 million. Well, it's probably more than that because of what's the allocation of the $54 million and where those funds come. So we haven't peeled apart all of the reasons why. I mean, we could do that more. I'm not sure that that's over. I think that may send us down a rabbit hole, frankly, especially this legislative session. But in general, those that have positive have a percentage, serve a smaller percentage of students in special education and our charter schools. So, and again, that's just kind of what's there. Okay. So kind of possible policy considerations that we've been kicking around. What's possible? What's the gap? There's a huge overlap of students who are both OSES group and our special education. So the issue of poverty, as we know, we've talked about that before, is huge. I don't know what we can do with that, but that's an issue that's out there. The other one is that if you take autism off the table and want to move the needle, so in my mind, talk about high incidence disabilities and low incidence disabilities. High incidence disability is things like learning disability, speech, those kinds of things. All the Group A weights or the Group B weights, they add on like $13. I always call those the hamburger kids because they buy a hamburger and a Coke. So the high incidence disability, if you take autism and the high incidence disabilities out, you have a remaining population of students who qualify for moderate intellectual disability, severe intellectual disability, orthopedic impairment, multiple disabilities, that kind of thing. Those kids cost a lot of money to be able to serve. The services that they require are tremendous. The overwhelming majority of those kids are in traditional public schools, or a better way to say that is the majority of those kids don't have school choice. That's the bottom line, right? They're either in a school district, they're assigned to a school, or they can't pick their local neighborhood charter school to go to. So one possible policy piece is simply looking at increasing the group B weights for that group of students, minus the autism. So low incidence disabilities, think of a student with Down syndrome, a student who's medically fragile, that kind of thing. There's a small proportion of kids, but it's a high dollar amount associated with that. Another one was possibly looking at busting up the autism category into maybe 3 buckets instead of 2. I think that has some practical implications that would make it difficult, honestly, because you're still going to get right back to an IEP meeting and where those decisions are made. I'm not sure those are tough pieces. I think it's something that just wanted to put on the screen to consider as a possibility. Okay. So with that, I'll wrap it up and throw it open if anybody has any other comments or questions on what I just presented, or hand it back to Paul if my time is up. Yep.
What's the direction that the department's taking on graduation requirements related to high school kids and special needs? That became an issue last year. I thought it was kind of put on the table, but I'm understanding we're right back from square one. We're in IEPs that are kind of in conflict. And when I looked at you guys' memo, it seems to be the exact same memo as last spring, just pushed it out.
So what about graduation? Us has the technical assistance document for graduation. We're firmly on square two, Greg. We took I'm hoping we're getting that feedback from special ed directors and Center for Disability Law. So first of all, graduation firmly rests with the decisions at the local level and what that looks like. I think as that document has shrunk down to a 2-page document instead of a 8 or 9-page document, the most critical is I would encourage you or your special ed folks to look at that document. The most critical information that's in there is what's not said as much as what is said. And what is said is that students with disabilities must take content courses that are aligned to standards. What isn't said is students with disabilities must take courses that are aligned to grade level standards. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John.
Yep. Thanks.
Clearly, lots of interesting topics and some things we could probably talk about all day. So we appreciate time and your presence here on, and that's, you can see why we'll invite him back every meeting. So some other interesting stuff may come up with our next guest, and that's Catcher Baden from the state board. So come on up, Catcher.
Thank you. My next on here. Here we go. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for having me yet again. One of these times, I swear I'll get Alicia out here. She's not avoiding you or anything. She loves you guys. She has another meeting right now, so you have to hear more from me, unfortunately. I'm going to try to run through this as quickly as possible to make sure you have enough time to transition to what you're doing next. But it is something that we want to talk about and we feel is vitally important. And this is one of the things that the board talked about at its retreat week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and it's around educator discipline. One of the reasons we wanted to bring it out to you all is, one, we do want to bring something to the legislature next year, and I know it's August, we're already talking about legislative session next year. I apologize. But the other reason is there is some interesting data and other items in here that we feel it's important to share out sooner rather than later. And so that's some of the stuff that I'm going to go through. I'm not going to run through this whole slide. Really, this is just a flow chart of how educator discipline works at the state. Just very simply, allegations of immoral or unprofessional conduct are made to the Department of Education. Their investigative unit investigates those allegations and then transfers the files to the State Board of Education. And then the board can take action on those cases, whether it's all the way from closing the case or a letter of censure, all the way up to a revocation of the certificate. And a lot of those actions end up going through the PPAC, which is the advisory committee made up of folks like yourself in the field, including some folks here in the room, who make recommendations to the full board. And then there's also a process which is very similar, which is for people who are applying for a certificate. So note that we're taking action on people who have a certificate or people who are applying for a certificate. That's important for later. So what we did is we looked a couple years ago when Alicia started as executive director, we looked at this whole process and we started evaluating it, sort of doing a self-audit in many ways. And one of the things that we discovered in that is that we don't have a lot of great data when it comes to enforcement actions, which is this whole process. And that's kind of hard to evaluate how well we're doing or what we're doing or if there's gaps without good data. So we started gathering, and it's not that it wasn't out there, it's just that the department's investigative unit had some of it, we had some of it, the AG's office had some of it, and we weren't compiling it and analyzing it in a way that we could make sense of. So that's what we started doing. Now this is just a one-pager of about a 10-page report. We put one out at the end of 2018, and then we revised it for June of 19 for our board retreat. We'll probably do it again at the end of the school year. So a couple things I want to point out that I think are big takeaways for folks in this room. And one is that the number of cases since 2012, 13, 14, 15 has increased. Now you notice there's a little spike here in 15 and 16. There was a backlog of cases. So the board started plowing through those in those 2 years. So that's a big reason for that increase. But we still have some increases here in 19. These are projections. And there are still cases in the pipeline right now. We feel pretty confident that we're probably going to have a record number of cases adjudicated in this year. And when I mean adjudicated, I mean a letter of censure, a revocation, a suspension. This is not all of the cases that the investigative unit at the department opens. They open a lot more. These are just the ones that end up getting adjudicated at the board. Another thing I want to point out is this blue line at the top. Those are cases involving sexual misconduct. And that ranges from everything from grooming behavior, so it's an educator showering affection on a student, texting them outside of class, asking to meet with them outside of school, all the way up until physical or verbal sexual acts themselves, all of it immoral or unprofessional. That's a very high number. That makes it 40%. That's the plurality of all the cases we adjudicate are sexual misconduct. The second highest number are cases is this gray line that's involving substance. Now substance is kind of a tough one, and so is assault. But those include things like alcohol and drug use. It could range from things like a first-time DUI. We have a discipline matrix that says if it's your first-time DUI, that's a letter of censure, maybe alcohol treatment, we move on. When it becomes a pattern of behavior, however, or if there's a lot of aggravating factors, like there were children in the car, there was a high BAC, or if you were supplying alcohol to minors or you showed up drunk or high to the classroom, that's when the discipline starts escalating into suspension, maybe even revocations. And then assault is also a pretty broad category. That obviously can include, assaulting your students or children. It could also include things, what we saw a big rash up, a big reason this has been increasing. It's been a lot more domestic violence cases and pretty egregious ones, and a pattern of those cases for whatever reason. We're still trying to figure that out. So big takeaways, I think here, cases are increasing and they're the most serious of the offenses. Now these other two, like fraud and breach, and then there's probably another one that's like other. Breach is like breach of contract. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Fraud is like stealing or embezzling. A lot of times we get those through the Auditor General's office, who makes us aware of things like that. There's also some cases, and it's a very low number, where it's things like an educator stole a password to change students' grades that they shouldn't have. Not the most egregious of cases, but it is something that's immoral or unprofessional conduct. But these make up the majority. Something else I want to point out is those numbers on the far side, which is probably also interesting or of use for folks in this room. The top one is the types of certificates that the board has taken action on. You'll notice substitute certificate holders makes up the majority of those. Now we're still making sure, and we're checking with the certification desk to see if this is a disproportionate number of certificates held in the state. But it's still interesting that the majority of these are, not the majority, the plurality of these are holding substitute certificates. And then when you couple that with the educator prep program, sorry, it's a little hard to see. And the EPP data, by the way, just a caveat, is not as comprehensive as this data from 2012, and that's because we weren't always collecting which EPP they went through, but it's still a pretty good representative sample. A lot come from in-state universities. That makes sense. We get, they produce a lot of our educators. Almost just as many come from out of state. So when you couple the fact that a lot of these folks are coming from out of state, and then a lot of them are substitute certificate holders, that starts having policy implications for the state as to, how do we help train? How do we help with identification and prevention? but it also has implications and hopefully is something that you all start thinking about internally. Another thing I want to mention here, maybe I should have mentioned at the beginning, the message here is not that everybody out there is engaging in sexual misconduct. This total number represents about 0.5% of the entire certified educator population. It's just that because of the increase in cases and the nature of them, we want to make sure people are aware of this, and we think it's something that we need to tackle. So we looked at all of this data and additionally looked at all the cases, and we started taking some actions internally. I won't go through all of these, but rest assured we took all of these actions within the confines of our statutory powers and duties to make the process more efficient, to try to close loopholes, to try to close gaps, and make improvements. Some of these are still ongoing. This one, like increased communication training with the field, that's something that we need to do a better job of. Right now, we've done it mostly at conferences and things like that, but we want to try to provide training that LEAs can take home with them, access online for free, and provide to their schools, and is still useful and tailored specifically to Arizona. So you probably get where I'm going with this after I said this is within our statutory powers and duties. There are things that we're going to be asking the legislature to change that we feel there are still loopholes out there that need to be addressed. This is a condensed slide. This was originally like 2 pages, and then of course we have statutory language, so that was like 80 pages. This is one slide, so there's a lot of context missing here, but I wanted to try to make it digestible. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of them that are probably relevant to this group. The first is the uncertified educators. The board, as I mentioned earlier, cannot take action on people who do not hold a certificate, and that's just the way the system's been built forever, really. There are a large percentage, not a large percentage, there are teachers who are not certified in schools now. And you might be thinking, well, charter schools, and that's true. About 40%, more or less, of charter school teachers do not hold a certificate. But there's still about 4% of district school teachers who do not hold a certificate. Those are folks that we can't take any sort of state action on. Now you might be thinking, well, fingerprint clearance cards, that should be sweeping up a lot of this behavior. And in many cases that's true, but if that were the case, then the board wouldn't have to take we wouldn't have to have that whole process. The board would just do whatever the fingerprint clearance card did and we'd call it a day. So there's obviously behaviors, and we have documented cases of behaviors of non-certified educators engaging in conduct that we would otherwise try to adjudicate as immoral or unprofessional conduct. And a lot of these are things that the fingerprint clearance card is tied in many ways to a conviction in a court of law. The board is operating under administrative proceedings, just like the rest of the state, and does not have to meet that same bar of beyond a reasonable doubt, in addition to the types of evidence that can be introduced. So a lot of times courts decline to prosecute a case for some reasons of what I just described. Sometimes it might take a while for a victim to come forward, maybe 10 years. Maybe that's really hard to prosecute in a court. But those are things that we can take action on at the board. In addition, there are some things that are maybe not necessarily in and of themselves a crime, but are still immoral or unprofessional conduct. And those were some of those grooming behaviors that I described earlier, or inappropriate communication with students. A couple other things, identification and prevention. I know that you see that and you think, the board, I thought you were my friend, and here you are with an unfunded mandate going to the legislature. Certainly empathize. We, as I mentioned, developed and provided by the State Board of Education. That's something that the board is going to develop specific to Arizona, and we are open to any ideas about any trainings that are existing that we can try to fold this into to try to make it as painless as possible. But we do think, as we've gone out and talked to folks, both at the classroom level and above, there are some gaps in knowledge about what databases to check before hiring, what to report to and when to report, and how to identify and prevent things like sexual misconduct. Alicia always likes to say, you know, when she started in the classroom and as an administrator, they didn't go over that in her EPP. There was no training or class specific to that. And so that's something that we want to try to fill in the gap. And then finally, contract breaks. You might be looking at this list and think one of these things is not like the other, and it's probably contract breaks. The board was looking at this whole list about, you know, how do we help prevent and adjudicate some of the worst cases, especially if we're seeing a rise in them. And contract breaks is certainly not the worst of the worst cases. And we're proposing eliminating the state discipline for those contract breaks. Currently in statute, it's classified as unprofessional conduct, and then governing boards can take disciplinary action, and the State Board of Ed can additionally take action on their cert. In the previous board, that was like a 6-month suspension on their certificate. This board is just issuing a letter of censure. I'll give you 2 reasons really briefly why the board is looking at this, and I know that there are some folks in the field who feel very passionately about the board continuing to take that kind of action. But the board is coming at this from a prioritization standpoint when we're talking about all these other types of cases. The investigative unit at the department still needs to investigate these cases. So even though the board is only issuing letters of censure, for the most part, all things being equal, the Department of Education still has to take time to issue the letter that they open the investigation, issue the letter of censure, and then close that investigative file. And the board considered, is that really time we want them spending on that when we have all of these other priorities, and their caseloads are already pretty high and potentially going to grow if we go with uncertified educator action. The second reason is more of a philosophical reason, and that is that this is a contract entered into by the governing board and by an individual entered into in good faith. The governing board can have their own liquidated damages, for example, in that contract. Is it really the state's role to take additional disciplinary action? Now, having said that, this is a statute that's been on the books for 30 years, maybe longer than that. We've also had a lot of teacher shortage issues. We still do. And I think the board is cognizant of that. And we're also aware that that is an issue that hits some of you harder than others. And so you probably maybe feel very passionately about the board maybe getting rid of this. But we did, when looking at this holistically on how to make this more efficient, that was one of the things that we identified. And as always, we're happy to talk more about this, work with you, and hear your concerns and potentially modify these as necessary. So I think I did all right on time. And then here's a couple of data slides because I couldn't let John go with I also have data. So the line graphs. Okay, that was it. So I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns that you may have.
One question.
I'm sorry, just one question or concern that you may have.
So I'm one of the folks that cares deeply and passionately about the ADE still keeping the 30-year-old
Yes.
law in place. Because so many of us, as you alluded to, are struggling with keeping staff. And I can tell you, we have liquidated damages and the teachers figure out, okay, whatever, we'll pay the liquidated damages. But when they ask, but what about ADE? Will I lose my certificate? Even though you typically don't, it's a letter, that weighs more on their decision to stay or leave in the middle of a contract than the liquidated damages. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Superintendent Berg, just to sum up, mentioned that the threat of potential action by the state on their certificate is more of an incentive than the liquidated damages in the liquidated damages in the contract. Incentive to stay, I guess, rather than a deterrent. I made it a positive. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the good information. So lots of good topics this morning. Get us all fired up, right? Who needs coffee? So we have one more guest here to share some more important information as well. That's Brian Hummel from the American Cancer Society Action Network. He's going to talk a little bit about vaping issues, which I think is becoming a big problem for a lot of us, for a lot of our students, and some potential legislation related to that. So Brian.
Thank you, Paul. So I was going to tell you a cute story about my daughter. She starts college today. So I wanted to thank everyone in this room as educators for putting her on the guide path. She actually wants to be a teacher and ultimately an administrator. So maybe 20 years from now, she'll be in this room. Yeah, right. So I work for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. We're the advocacy arm of the American Cancer Society. So I want to tell you very briefly about cancer. I know we're short on time. The important thing here, more than 37,000 people will be diagnosed with cancer in the state of Arizona this year. It is the second leading cause of death in the state of Arizona. More than 12,000 people will die from cancer this year. The number one is heart disease and stroke. Important, about 30% of cancer deaths are tobacco related. Now, here we go with the proposal. E-cigarettes. What are e-cigarettes? Well, there are lots of things. You see all this junk every day. More commonly, you see the thing to your left, Juul, and the thing in the middle on the bottom, Soren. But you see all of this stuff. And the ones on the bottom row on the ends, I want to point out, that's called vaporware. So there's an exciting new challenge for you to deal with. Backpacks and hoodies with vape inside with a little hose, like a water, the camel thing that you take hiking. Yeah, kind of like that. So that's one of the things e-cigarettes are. But important to note, when we do data, when they put out the surveys that the kids do in school, they have been asking, have you ever used an e-cigarette? As you know, kids think they're juuling. They're not using an e-cigarette. They are. Okay, so they will be I believe, changing the question that they ask to include some of the brand names of some of these products. What else are e-cigarettes? They are not. It is not water vapor. It is not. It is not. So one of the things almost all of these things have is nicotine. And then because these things are not really standardized and not regulated well by the federal government, they have lots of stuff. And frankly, a lot of unknown stuff. In the studies that have been done, all these different junk, metals. There are, in some of them, cancer-causing materials. And that's one of the reasons why we're involved. But another reason why we're involved, I'll get to in a second, is that this truly has become a gateway. Kids who normally would not use conventional cigarettes, through the use of these, become addicted to nicotine, and then the cheaper route is using a conventional cigarette, and ultimately end up using cigarettes because they're so addicted to the nicotine. What else is it? It's an epidemic. These fellas are national health figures. Every single one of them has called it an epidemic. Why are e-cigarettes considered tobacco at the federal level? There's a court case, blah, 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 very long here. But the important thing to note is in 2009, these companies actually went to court to stop the FDA from regulating them as a medical device because they wanted to be called tobacco. Their industry wanted to be called tobacco. We opposed that. A federal judge agreed with them, so they're tobacco. You get to be tobacco. They have learned that's not a great place to be associated with. That's why they've gone through the naming. They don't want to be called e-cigarettes. They want to be called vapor products, right? Big vape equals big tobacco. All of these companies, almost every single one of them that you see, have investors or are owned by big tobacco companies. Okay, this is horrible, horrible news. They changed the study methodology in about 2013, I believe, some of the national figures. We used to be fantastic. Our actual smoking rate by adults was going down, got to 14% in 2015. That rate is now going up. That's the wrong way. Arizona youth tobacco use rates, horrendous. Study by the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission came out in December of last year. Almost 20% of high school age students are using a survey of 48,000 students. Almost 20% of them use a cigarette sometimes 30. And then here, the Arizona Attorney General's office does what are sting buys. They send a kid in. They use the ID with their picture and their birth date on it, real ID, go in and try to purchase things. When they ask those kids to go in and try to purchase an e-cigarette, 39% of the time they're successful. Okay, so this is why I'm here. Mark heard me speak at an event at the Capitol. We expect basically a replay, but worse, of legislation last year. At the local level, we are working right now with the city of Tucson, Pima County, Flagstaff, Yuma, Surprise, hopefully Phoenix, on regulating these products like tobacco. In order to do so, Arizona is one of 12 states that does not have a tobacco retail license. That's going to be the biggest push that we're going to do. If you can continue to sell this junk to kids and all you get is a $300 fine, that's not going to work anymore. We need to put a license to stop these people from selling this junk to kids in the first place. If they fail 3 times in a 3-year period, they should have their license taken away. Tobacco products. They keep selling regulated product and continue to sell it to kids. They need to have the right taken away to sell these products. I know we're short on time. Hopefully that did it. I'll be around if people have questions. Let me know.
So could you talk a little bit about the legislation pushed by Big Tobacco versus Heather Carter's approach?
Yeah, so this is really important. You will hear 21, tobacco 21. We're in favor generally of raising the sale age of tobacco to the age of 21. The tobacco industry has now come in and adopted. They say they want to do it, but in order for them to do it, they want what's called preemption. They want to preempt cities and towns. And in the case of the original legislation that went through the Arizona House of Representatives Health Committee, they wanted to restrict schools. As a matter of fact, they wanted to take away a 20-year-old law that prevents the use and possession of tobacco on school campuses. So it's really important when we get into this, and it will happen again this year, when people are fighting about tobacco control legislation, you need to know where it's coming from. The tobacco industry is hot and heavy. What we have decided is we're not going to sit back anymore and play defense. In this instance, the best defense is a strong offense. If we're out there, we have a proposal, and this is what we learned last year. We had a proposal. The tobacco industry came in with a proposal. When we're talking about health, who should be deciding health issues? The health community or big tobacco? In our legislature, that's not an easy question, but we at least are winning on that answer. So did that explain?
So my understanding was that Big Tobacco's legislation said the state would raise the age to 21, but no city or town or any municipality could then regulate
the sale
vapor products and how they're sold in store.
Exactly. They cannot regulate the sale and marketing of these products under the legislation that was envisioned by Representative John Allen.
And those weren't tobacco products, right? So raising
tobacco, and that's a very interesting distinction. In the state of Arizona, although there's a federal court ruling that says this stuff is a tobacco product, in state law, in 2013, the Arizona legislature specifically, at the behest of the tobacco industry, specifically singled out these products and called them vapor products. It's the same penalty for a kid. It's the same penalty for a clerk as possession and sale and use of tobacco products, but it's not defined as a tobacco product. That's an important distinction. There are a bunch of titles of Arizona law. That's in Title 13. In Title 36 is the part where it says you can't have tobacco, can't use or possess tobacco on school campus. That was not dealt with in 2013. It's why all of your individual school districts set up policies, because there wasn't a state law that addressed it.
Mark, so what are the implications when we roll in cannabis?
Yeah, plenty. Yeah, there's plenty. Yeah,
Repeat his question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The question was, what about cannabis injected into this conversation? So that's a great question. It is incredibly pervasive and has become more so. I can tell you that the Attorney General's office has a sort of collection agreement with certain schools and districts around the state. They used to look at the devices that have been confiscated looking for nicotine because there was this, it's just water vapor, it's not addictive. 97% of the time when they tested it, it had nicotine in it. Now they're starting to look at other items that might be included in the product. So, yeah, but there are, and of course, there's a legalization effort that's going on as well. There are tons of sort of side issues that sprout from that, for sure. Yes, sir.
Heather Carter's on the right path on this one. If you're interested, give her a call and tell her your support or whatever you need, and she'll jump on you.
Yeah. So the biggest champion for this legislation is Senator Heather Carter. She actually had 4 pieces of legislation last year on tobacco control, including the taxation of these products to try to make it less likely that a kid would be able to buy it. She is the champion for this. We actually are accumulating new champions as well. Her effort really brought some really strong leadership from the legislature, and we're hoping to work with those folks on some of these issues so that, again, we can be on the offense here, that we're not just trying to defend against the tobacco industry coming in trying to tell a story that they're just there to protect kids. Thank you for having me, and thanks for what you do.
So last but not least, before we get to division meetings, I wanted to introduce Dr. Jornstad, just to take this opportunity to thank him for the great leadership he's provided for ASA.
Okay, we've got a few events going on here. There's a couple qualified evaluator trainings I was going to call your attention to, one in Prescott and one in Tucson, but guess what? They're filled and beyond capacity. We do have the Principal and the Law Conference, September 19th, which will cover a lot of these same legal issues that were talked about today. That's at the Black Canyon Conference Center. Principal and the Law Conference. Then we have September 29th to October 1st, the Fall Superintendent's Higher Ed Conference. And then you'll also see the Secondary Division Drive-In Unconference, October 24th for the high school principals. Our next division meeting is October 21st. You'll see some other qualified evaluator trainings there as well. So there's a lot of activity ongoing in the next couple months. And our division meetings, which will be starting in about 5 minutes, and you can see those rooms for your particular division that's going on right there. I think you can read, so I won't read them to you. So we got 5 minutes to reconvene in these rooms. Superintendents are staying here. Thank you.
Dr. G.